Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to build on leveraging the command line arguments to use our driver to essentially power or drive our sample user file that we have. And we're going to do this through our user class. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to refresh our memory on some of the features in our user class that we wish to test. One of which is our import custom. And then we also have the import XML that we're going to come back to. But then later on in the class, as an instance method, we also have our export custom and export XML. And so the idea here is that we want to use our user driver to be able to test the functionality in that class before we move on to turning it into a GUI project. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a couple of static methods. And this is okay because we're not necessarily interested in developing an object-oriented driver necessarily. If anything, we're going to use this driver more in a procedural way to test our sample file or our user class. So in this case, what we're going to have is we're going to have a public static. And I would suggest, rather than a void, I would suggest simply having a Boolean. And we're going to start off now with our import custom, which I'm going to go ahead and name the exact same way that the functions are named in my user class, although this is completely unnecessary. And then what we want to do is we want to decide what arguments need to be passed to this public static Boolean for testing purposes. And the ultimate idea here is that we want to be able to import a sample.user file or a .user file. We don't need to necessarily pass the entire array of arguments. So we can probably come back and revisit this, but at the very least, we simply just need to pass a file name. All right, and then before we forget, we might as well go ahead and stub these in. So we'll have a public static Boolean for import XML. And quick check. All right, we did leave it capitalized here, so it's going to be XML. And likewise with this one, we're also going to just simply accept a file name. You could also accept, for instance, a file object. And then continuing on with stubbing this in, we also want to have public static Boolean export custom. And at this point, then, what we're going to do is rather than pass it a file name, what we're going to do is we're actually going to do all of the setup in our export custom function, as well as a public static Boolean export XML. So essentially what we're doing there is we're doing a slightly more sophisticated version of our unit testing that we had talked about earlier. In other words, this is actually testing a little bit more complex behavior, and this is the same approach that you would do if you were testing components that contain multiple classes. And you can also leverage the unit tests in this as well. But we're going to keep this fairly straightforward. So for these four functions, then, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and have a return value here. So we're going to make a Boolean results, and we're going to set it equal to, let's be optimistic here. We're going to go ahead and set it equal to true. And then we simply return true. Now we'll have to keep in mind that we'll need to set our logic up in such a way to change that if necessary. All right, but at the very least, this gets the red to go away. And that's, we always want to make sure that we have code that can compile. Now, the goal here is to simply make sure that we can wire our main up to these individual functions. All right. And so in an earlier video, I had shown you how to leverage the arguments from the command line, and we're going to continue to build on this. And so as before, we simply just looped through all the arguments. This time around, we want to go ahead and create somewhat of a, I guess you could say, a triage logic that handles what types of switches have been passed to our main. And the first thing that you should note is that the export custom and the export XML don't require a file name. All they will require is some sort of switch that indicates which function you want to run. Now, we could skip this and simply hard code in the functions and then simply comment and uncomment them as we wanted to test them, but that doesn't really allow for a lot of flexibility in our testing, and it also doesn't really allow for any automation. So rather than do that, we want to just set up a relatively crude way to simply test the functions at will. And to start off with, the easiest thing to do is just look at the argument count. So we have our export custom and our export XML that both are going to require one argument, whereas our import custom and our import XML are going to require two, the switch and the file name. So there's a number of different ways that we could write our logic. When I'm prototyping, I usually suggest just simply a flat logic structure. In other words, don't overthink it too much. And one way to handle this would just simply to be used to use the short circuiting operators. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to just simply look at the number of arguments. And so we'll say if our args dot length, okay, is going to be equal to 1, and well, if we have an argument there, that means that we can actually compare it. So in this case, it's going to be args square bracket 0. And then what we want to do is we're going to use our equals ignore case to another string. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to compare it now to the export custom. And as before, or as I suggest, just because it's pretty common in other executables, I would suggest prefixing any switches with either a flag, a slash or a dash. In this case, I'm just going to keep with a slash. And so if our equals ignore case, which you will recall, if we pull up the help here, if our equals ignore case, which returns a Boolean, if this returns true, then we assume that we've got the correct number of arguments and we have the right switch passed to it. So in this case, we're going to say equal to true. If those two conditions are true, then what we want to do, I think I've got some mismatched parentheses here. Let's do this one more time. Yes, so in 1 second, there we go. I think, there we go. Just had some mismatched parentheses, no big deal. All right, so if those two conditions are true, then what we want to do is we simply want to make a call to our export custom. So the other thing that I would suggest you do up here in your main is also go ahead and provide a Boolean results variable. And what we can do now is inside of our if structure, we just simply say results are going to be equal to our export custom. And then what you can do to follow this up, you can simply say system.out print line. And what I would suggest you do is something like export custom returned, and then whatever the value is for the results. Once again, I'm just trying to set us up with a nice structure to test our functionality. Now, inside of our export custom, we aren't going to put any code yet in this video. Instead, what I want us to do is just simply put a placeholder here, a noisemaker, if you would, and do system.out.println, and then something like calling export custom. All right, doesn't have to be any more sophisticated than that. You can turn this off later if you wish to. And I'm simply going to replicate this pattern then for each one of my functions that I plan on implementing. All right, so we have our import. Got a little copy and paste happy there. All right, so import XML, and then lastly, then our export XML. All right, just a little more tidying up in the main, and then we're ready to test this one. The condition, if you notice here for our export XML, is very similar to that for our export custom. So we'll follow this up then with an else if. And in this case, the only thing that really changes then is going to be the export XML. But now when we get to the other functions, we're going to have to change then not only the switch, but also the number of arguments. Okay, so in this case, then we want to have the file names. So we're going to have import custom is going to require 2 arguments, and then lastly, our import XML is also going to require 2 arguments. And then under the else, we simply want to print a friendly message to the user, warning, unhandled switch, or help. Okay, so in other words, if you want to get a little more sophisticated, if you plan on having this turn into a production-ready application as opposed to just something to test, then you would want to go ahead and include some more documentation with it. Essentially, from there, then, it's just a matter of replicating what we did in the first branch of this if statement. And we just finish this out here with results are equal to export XML. And we continue on here with our system out print line export XML returned. And then the value of results. All right. Now, to begin with, I have results true, and I've hard-coded true in here. Probably want to go ahead and make a quick change here as well. Go ahead and use our return variable. And then, of course, then the last step would then just simply be to go ahead and call our 2 import functions. And so in this case, then results are going to be equal to import XML. And the only problem with it is that we have to decide then Are we going to check for the file's existence before or after passing it to our function? And so in this particular case, since this is more of a prototype testing application, it's not as important to factor out the code. If this was a production application, we'd probably come up with a more streamlined approach to do it. And for this example, I'm actually going to test that the file name exists inside of the import custom and the import XML. So all I'm going to do here with my import custom is I'm simply just going to pass my args square bracket 1. In other words, that first argument that gets passed after the switch. All right, and then like before, we're going to just simply use system.out.println, and in this case, it's for our import custom. And then the last possibility is going to be then our import XML. So once again, a little bit of copying and pasting. But aside from that, then we've pretty much got our structure set up, barring any typos. Once again, please make sure to go ahead and change the return. Instead of hard coding true, which is just out of habit for testing, make sure and return results, because what we can do is we can then change the results value inside of the functions. All right, so barring any typos, we should be set to test this. So go ahead and build it. And we'll come along over here and we'll start off just by passing no arguments at all. And you should get the warning that says unhandled switch. That's looking promising. As well as if you just put in something like Bob, you'll get an argument count of 1, but you'll still get an unhandled switch. So what we want to do now is we want to take a look at some of our scenarios here. We'll start with our export. So it's going to be export custom. And you can see here that it recognized the export custom switch, and it is calling the export custom function, the static function that we created. And at this point, it's just returning true. Notice I didn't actually have to cast anything. Java will take a Boolean results and essentially do a toString on it, and a true returns the string true and a false returns the string false. So realize it sounds a little strange, emphasizing the fact that basically that it is a Boolean data type, but the toString method returns a string. Continuing on with this here, we have our export XML. And once again, that seems to be wired up correctly. We're going to test now our import function. So we have import custom. Import custom, it recognizes the switch. Okay, at least it recognizes that we have a switch there. So count is 1. However, it indicates that it fell through our if-else-if structure. In other words, it returned then a unhandled switch, meaning that it wasn't handled in any of our cases there, which means that we then need to provide a file name. So we're going to go ahead, even though we don't have it set up yet, we're going to go ahead and provide it our sample.user. Okay, and you'll notice that it is calling our import custom, and import custom then returned a value of true. And then the last example that we want to test then is going to be our import XML and sample.xml. Once again, even though that we don't have them completely set up yet, at least we can test the functions. Now, one thing I'd recommend doing that would help out a little bit here is in your import custom and in your import XML, since it technically is accepting an input argument, what you could do is you can modify your system.out.println, and we can say something like calling import custom with, and then specify the file name. Once again, this is just getting a little fancier, but the idea here is that anything you can do to provide some positive feedback while you are testing, particularly if it leads to some sort of automated testing, could save you a lot of time in the long run here. So I'm going to make that quick change. All right, and then if you notice, if I test my import custom, it says calling import custom with sample.user, and import XML calls it with sample.xml. In another video, we're going to take a look at actually putting code in these functions, but the purpose here is to build up the structure that you're going to need to test more and more complicated features in your program before putting a graphical user interface on top of it. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to email me